Number 1. Skylar Sophia De Leon. Skylar De Leon was born John Jacobson Jr. in 1979, a former child actor who appeared on Power Rangers. By 2004, at 25 years old, that innocent television persona had transformed into something unrecognizable, something capable of unthinkable evil. Thomas Hawks was a retired probation officer and bodybuilder who, with his second wife Jackie, owned a 55-foot yacht called the Well-Deserved. For 2 years, they had sailed the Pacific Ocean and Gulf of California, living their dream retirement aboard their floating sanctuary. The name couldn't have been more appropriate, or more tragically ironic. The Hawks had worked their entire lives for this freedom. They bought the yacht for $300,000, and their tight-knit circle of friends and family agreed the name, Well-Deserved, was perfectly fitting. But when news of a grandchild's birth reached them, they made a fateful decision. The boat would be sold. They would return to Arizona to be closer to family. De Leon learned of the yacht's availability through criminal channels. The Well-Deserved represented more than a boat. It symbolized wealth, freedom, and opportunity. Everything De Leon wanted but hadn't earned. The plan that formed in their mind was as cold as it was calculated. November 15, 2004. During a test cruise near Santa Catalina Island, De Leon and 2 co-conspirators subdued the Hawks and forced them to sign sales documents. What began as a routine boat showing became a nightmare beyond comprehension. The elderly couple, seasoned by decades of life experience, sensed something wrong. They begged for their lives. But De Leon had already decided their fate. They were tied to a 65-pound anchor, the weight that would drag them to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Imagine those final moments. Thomas and Jackie Hawks, bound together, pleading with people they had trusted enough to invite aboard their sanctuary. The cold metal of the anchor chain cutting into their flesh. The realization that their dream retirement, their well-deserved peace, would end not in their own bed surrounded by loved ones, but in the dark depths of the ocean. De Leon tied them to an anchor and tossed them into the ocean. The bodies have never been recovered. Somewhere in the Pacific, Thomas and Jackie Hawks found their final resting place, their love story ending in the crushing darkness of the deep. The crime didn't end with the Hawks' deaths. De Leon had also murdered John Jarvie in 2003, demonstrating a pattern of violence that suggested this wasn't a crime of passion, but calculated brutality. De Leon was sentenced to death in 2009 for the Hawks murders and separately convicted of Jarvie's death. The case gained additional notoriety years later when it was revealed that De Leon, while on death row, had received taxpayer-funded gender reassignment surgery, transitioning from male to female. The transformation from child actor to convicted killer to death row transgender inmate represents one of California's most complex criminal cases. De Leon's story reveals how deeply evil can hide behind familiar faces. The child star who entertained families became a predator who destroyed them. Number 2. Manling Sang Williams. Manling Sang Williams was 27 years old when she methodically destroyed her entire family. A quiet mother living in the affluent suburb of Rowland Heights, she appeared to neighbors as an ordinary woman managing the routines of domestic life with her husband Neil, 27, and their 2 young sons. Devin, 7 years old. Ian, just younger. By all accounts, the family lived modestly in their comfortable home, far from the violence that would soon consume them all. Before that August night in 2007, Williams maintained a careful facade of suburban normalcy. Born in Taiwan, she had immigrated to the United States and built what seemed like a stable life. Friends describe her as reserved, even distant at times, but nothing suggested the calculated fury that lay beneath her controlled exterior. Court records reveal a woman who had grown increasingly resentful of her marriage and family obligations, though the full extent of her psychological deterioration remained hidden from those closest to her. The marriage itself had become strained. According to testimony, Williams harbored deep anger toward her husband, feeling trapped in a life she no longer wanted. Prosecutors would later argue that her resentment had festered for months, building toward an inevitable explosion. Yet those who knew the family saw only glimpses of discord. Neighbors recalled occasional raised voices, but nothing that suggested the methodical violence Williams was planning in the quiet hours before dawn. On August 22nd, 2007, Williams made her choice. Armed with a 20-inch samurai sword from the family's collection, she entered her husband's bedroom as he slept. What followed was not a crime of passion, but a sustained, calculated assault. She struck Neil Williams more than 90 times, prosecutors said, slashing and stabbing until his body was brutally dismembered. The sword was heavy, sharp, deliberately chosen for maximum damage. Each blow was intentional. Each cut was purposeful. But Williams was not finished. Moving through the house with methodical precision, she went to her son's bunk beds. Devin and Ian lay sleeping, unaware their mother had become their executioner. Using a pillow, she pressed down on each child's face, suffocating them slowly as they struggled against her grip. Medical examiners would later confirm both boys died of asphyxiation, their small bodies bearing the evidence of their final, desperate fight for air. When police arrived at the scene hours later, they discovered carnage that veteran investigators described as among the worst they had ever witnessed. Neil Williams' body was so severely mutilated, it was barely recognizable. The children lay motionless in their beds, their faces bearing the telltale signs of suffocation. Williams herself was found covered in blood, sitting calmly in the aftermath of her methodical destruction. During initial questioning, Williams provided conflicting accounts of what had occurred. She claimed self-defense, alleging her husband had attacked her first. But forensic evidence told a different story entirely. The positioning of Neil's wounds, the lack of defensive injuries, and the calculated nature of the children's murders revealed a woman who had planned and executed the annihilation of her family with chilling deliberation. Charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, Williams faced the ultimate penalty. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of domestic abuse, arguing that years of psychological trauma had driven her to a breaking point. They painted Neil Williams as controlling and abusive, claiming their client had snapped under unbearable pressure. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological effects of prolonged abuse, suggesting Williams had acted in a dissociative state. Prosecutors rejected this narrative entirely. They presented evidence of premeditation, pointing to the deliberate choice of weapon and the systematic manner in which each family member was killed. The samurai sword required significant force and intent. The suffocation of 2 sleeping children could not be explained away as self-defense or temporary insanity. This was, they argued, the calculated elimination of 3 human beings by someone who had grown tired of her family responsibilities. The first jury convicted Williams on all counts in 2010, finding her guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances of using a weapon and lying in wait. But when it came to sentencing, the same jury deadlocked on whether to recommend life imprisonment or death. A second penalty phase jury was convened, and after hearing all evidence again, they recommended the ultimate punishment. On January 19, 2012, Williams was formally sentenced to death. Judge Bob Martinez addressed her directly, calling her actions selfish and stating she must suffer the penalty of death. He noted that she had shown no remorse throughout the proceedings, displaying the same cold attachment that had characterized her on the night of the murders. Her hair covered her face as she looked down, offering no words, no explanation, no apology for the 3 lives she had taken. Psychological evaluations conducted during trial suggested Williams possessed narcissistic tendencies and an inability to empathize with others' suffering. Experts describe her as manipulative and self-centered, someone who viewed her family as obstacles to her personal freedom rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. Her claims of abuse were examined and largely discredited, with evidence showing she had been the primary aggressor in most domestic disputes. Williams now sits on death row at Central California Women's Facility, where she has spent over a decade awaiting execution. Appeals continue, but the evidence against her remains overwhelming. 3 lives were extinguished by the person who should have protected them most. A husband and 2 children who trusted her completely became victims of her calculated rage. In the end, Manling saying Williams represents the ultimate violation of family trust. Her actions were not those of a desperate woman defending herself, but of someone who chose murder as a solution to domestic dissatisfaction. The samurai sword and pillow she used as instruments of death stand as symbols of premeditated evil. Justice demanded the harshest penalty, and Williams will likely spend her remaining years contemplating the irreversible consequences of one night's horrific choices. Janine Marie Snyder. Janine Marie Snyder was sentenced to death in California on September 7, 2006 for the rape, torture, and murder of Michelle Curran on April 17, 2001. She was 30 years old when she participated in one of the most depraved crimes in California's criminal history. Michelle Curran was a 16-year-old Las Vegas girl with her whole life ahead of her. Bright, innocent, trusting, everything that made her a target in the twisted game that Snyder and her boyfriend Michael Thornton had devised. The couple had developed a sick fantasy. They hunted teenage girls, not for quick crimes, but for prolonged torture and sexual assault. They called it their game. The reality was pure evil disguised as recreational activity. April 17, 2001, Michelle Curran disappeared from Las Vegas. Her family reported her missing, beginning a frantic search that would end in unthinkable horror. Inside a barn on a woman's ranch in Southern California, the body of a naked and beaten 16-year-old girl was discovered with a single bullet wound to her head. The scene investigators encountered defied human comprehension. Evidence suggested Michelle had been held for days, tortured, sexually assaulted repeatedly. The physical trauma told a story of sustained cruelty that pushed the boundaries of human evil. 2 other teenage girls testified at the trial, revealing the broader scope of Snyder and Thornton's predatory behavior. These survivors provided crucial testimony about the couple's methods, their selection criteria, and their complete lack of remorse. Snyder wasn't a reluctant participant manipulated by a dominant partner. Court testimony revealed her active involvement in every aspect of the crime. She helped lure Michelle. She participated in the torture. She was present for the sexual assault. She watched as Thornton delivered the final bullet to Michelle's head. The prosecution painted a picture of 2 individuals feeding off each other's depravity, escalating their crimes through mutual encouragement. There was no hierarchy of evil. Both were equally culpable, equally monstrous. Loved ones tearfully testified Curran was killed before she got her driver's license, before she ever attended prom, before she graduated from high school. The litany of firsts that Michelle would never experience became a haunting reminder of the life stolen by Snyder's actions. The case became even more significant when Thornton died in prison in October 2024, leaving Snyder as the sole survivor of their deadly partnership. She remains at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, ineligible for parole due to her condemned sentence. Janine Marie Snyder's story represents the darkest possibilities of human nature. Her crimes weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated acts of pure sadism that destroyed not only Michelle Curran, but countless others who loved her. Justice in this case means ensuring that such evil never again walks free among the innocent. Sherry Lash Rhodes. Sherry Lash Rhodes murdered 4 people and critically injured 2 others in a 2014 shooting spree in the tribal headquarters of the Cedarville Rancheria, a small American Indian tribe in Northern California. As the former chairwoman of this remote tribal community, she held a position of trust and leadership that made her subsequent actions all the more devastating to those who knew her. Before the massacre, Rhodes had been a familiar figure in the small community of Alturas, California. The Cedarville Rancheria, home to fewer than a dozen tribal members, represented one of the smallest recognized tribes in the United States. Located in California's rural northeastern corner, the community existed in relative isolation, where personal disputes could fester for years without outside intervention or resolution. Police arrested Rhodes on suspicion that she did just that Thursday in Alturas, leaving 4 dead and 2 wounded in a gun and knife attack at a meeting on whether to evict Rhodes from one of the 9 little houses on the rancheria. The tension had been building for months as tribal members grew increasingly concerned about Rhodes' behavior and leadership decisions. Financial disputes, accusations of mismanagement, and personal conflicts had created a toxic environment within the tiny community. Court records revealed that tribal members had grown fearful of Rhodes' volatile temperament and erratic decision-making. Some describe her as increasingly paranoid and suspicious of other tribal members, believing they were plotting against her leadership. The eviction meeting had been called as a last resort, with community members hoping to resolve the situation through official tribal procedures. On February 20th, 2014, what should have been a routine tribal meeting became the scene of unprecedented violence. It all happened during a meeting at the Altura's headquarters where tribal leaders had gathered to address ongoing disputes. Rhodes arrived at the meeting armed with multiple weapons, including firearms and knives, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous outburst of violence. The attack began without warning. Rhodes opened fire on the assembled tribal members, targeting individuals she perceived as threats to her position or authority. The small meeting room provided no escape for victims, who were trapped in close quarters with an armed assailant. 4 people died in the assault, while 2 others suffered critical injuries that required immediate medical intervention. Witnesses who survived described a methodical, cold-blooded attack rather than a crime of passion. Rhodes moved through the room systematically, using both firearms and knives to ensure her victims could not survive to testify against her. The level of violence exceeded what could be explained by simple anger or frustration, revealing a calculated decision to eliminate perceived enemies permanently. Emergency responders arriving at the scene encountered carnage that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers. The isolated location meant that help arrived too late for the victims, though prompt medical intervention saved the lives of the 2 critically injured survivors. Their testimony would prove crucial in reconstructing the events and establishing Rhodes' culpability. Sherry Lash Rhodes, 44, was in Modoc County Superior Court in Alturas, California, for arraignment on 4 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The charges reflected the scope of the violence and the premeditated nature of the attack. Prosecutors emphasized that the multiple victims and use of various weapons demonstrated consciousness of guilt and deliberate intent to cause maximum harm. The legal proceedings revealed the complexity of prosecuting crimes involving tribal sovereignty and jurisdiction. While the murders occurred on tribal land, the severity of the crimes and the need for capital punishment required cooperation between tribal, state, and federal authorities. This coordination ensured that Rhodes would face the full weight of California's criminal justice system. Sherry Louise Lash Rhodes, 47, was convicted in December of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury's verdict reflected their rejection of any mitigation arguments and their conclusion that Rhodes had acted with deliberate premeditation. The evidence of planning and the systematic nature of the attack left no doubt about her guilt or the appropriateness of first-degree murder charges. During the penalty phase, prosecutors presented evidence about the impact of the murders on the surviving tribal community. The tiny population meant that every death represented a significant percentage of the tribe's membership, fundamentally altering the community's ability to function and maintain its cultural identity. The trauma experienced by survivors would have lasting effects on the entire tribal structure. Expert testimony revealed that Rhodes displayed characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial behavior patterns. Her inability to accept criticism or challenges to her authority had escalated over time, culminating in the violent elimination of perceived threats. However, no evidence suggested she suffered from mental illness that would have impaired her understanding of right and wrong. The judge sentenced Lash Rhodes to death for the 4 people she murdered and 150 years to life for the attempted murder cases and special allegations. This sentence reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but also the aggravating circumstances surrounding them. The abuse of her leadership position, the multiple victims, and the devastating impact on a small community all contributed to the court's decision to impose capital punishment. The case highlighted the unique challenges facing small tribal communities in addressing internal disputes and preventing violence. The isolation that protected traditional ways of life also made it difficult to intervene when conflicts escalated beyond the community's ability to resolve them peacefully. The massacre effectively destroyed the Cedarville Rancheria as a functioning tribal entity. Victim impact statements described the irreparable harm caused not only to individual families, but to the tribal community as a whole. The loss of traditional knowledge holders and community leaders represented a cultural catastrophe that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives while preserving what remained of their tribal identity. Psychological evaluations conducted for the court suggested that Rhodes' actions stemmed from an inability to cope with perceived challenges to her authority and status. Her willingness to destroy her own community rather than accept diminished power revealed a level of narcissism and antisocial behavior that made her fundamentally dangerous to society. Lash roads will not be eligible for custody credits, ensuring that she will remain incarcerated until her execution or natural death. The finality of this sentence reflects the court's recognition that her crimes were so severe and her danger to society so great that no possibility of rehabilitation or release could be considered. Belinda Magana. Belinda Magana was 29 years old when she received California's death sentence for the torture murder of her 2-year-old son, Malachi. Belinda Jeanette Magana, 29, and Naresh Michael Nareen, 43, were convicted in January of the 2009 slaying of Malachi Magana, living in Corona, California, with her boyfriend Naresh Nareen. She presented an ordinary face to the outside world while subjecting her toddler to systematic abuse that would ultimately cost him his life. Before the murder, Magana appeared to neighbors and acquaintances as a young mother struggling with the challenges of raising a toddler. She worked sporadically in retail positions while caring for Malachi, though friends later testified that she seemed overwhelmed by parental responsibilities. The relationship with Nareen introduced a volatile dynamic into the household. Two of Nareen's ex-wives testified about how he hit them, establishing a pattern of domestic violence that would eventually extend to Malachi. Witnesses described an increasingly tense household where minor infractions by the toddler resulted in escalating punishment and abuse. The mother of a Corona toddler, who was scalded, denied medical care and beaten when he cried in pain for days until he died, represents the systematic nature of the abuse that preceded Malachi's death. The scalding incident marked the beginning of several days of torture that would end with the child's death from his injuries, combined with deliberate medical neglect. The torture began when 2-year-old Malachi was scalded with hot water, causing severe burns across significant portions of his small body. Instead of seeking immediate medical attention that could have saved his life, Magana and Nareen chose to keep the injured child at home. Medical experts later testified that prompt treatment would have prevented the infections and complications that ultimately caused Malachi's death. Over the following days, the toddler's condition deteriorated as his burns became infected and his pain intensified. Rather than showing compassion for their suffering child, Magana and Nareen became increasingly angry at his cries for help. Beaten when he cried in pain for days until he died demonstrates the callous response to a child's natural reaction to severe physical trauma. Court testimony revealed that Malachi endured systematic physical abuse during his final days. Medical examiners found evidence of multiple injuries inflicted over time, including bruises, burns, and internal trauma consistent with repeated beatings. The level of violence exceeded what could be explained by momentary anger, revealing a pattern of deliberate torture inflicted on a helpless toddler. The duo is charged with first-degree murder with torture and assault of a child resulting in great bodily injury. The torture specification reflected the prosecuting attorney's recognition that Malachi's death resulted not from a single incident, but from prolonged, intentional infliction of pain and suffering. This legal distinction carried significant implications for the potential punishment both defendants would face. The investigation revealed the systematic nature of the abuse through physical evidence and witness testimony. Neighbors reported hearing screaming from the residents during the days preceding Malachi's death, though none intervened or contacted authorities. The isolated nature of the abuse allowed it to continue, without outside intervention that might have saved the child's life. Both Belinda and Michael were charged with 1 count each of murder, torture, and assault on a child causing death. The multiple charges reflected different aspects of the same criminal conduct, ensuring that the legal system could address both the deliberate infliction of torture and the ultimate result of that abuse. The torture charge carried the possibility of a death sentence due to its heinous nature. During the trial, medical experts provided detailed testimony about Malachi's injuries and the timeline of his suffering. The burns alone would have been survivable with proper medical care, but the combination of untreated wounds, infection, and continued physical abuse created a deadly spiral that ended in the toddler's death. The deliberate denial of medical care elevated the charges beyond simple abuse to murder. Riverside County Superior Court Judge Bernard Schwartz upheld jurors' recommendations that the defendants receive capital punishment. The jury's unanimous verdict reflected their conclusion that the aggravating circumstances of the crime far outweighed any potential mitigating factors. The systematic torture of a helpless child by his primary caregivers represented the kind of crime that demanded society's ultimate punishment. Victim impact statements during the penalty phase described the devastating loss of Malachi's potential and the trauma experienced by family members who learned of his suffering. The toddler's extended family testified about their love for him and their inability to comprehend how anyone could deliberately harm such an innocent child. Their statements emphasize the human cost of Magana's choices and the irreversible nature of her actions. Psychological evaluations conducted for the court revealed limited insight into Magana's motivations for participating in her son's torture and murder. While some experts suggested she may have been influenced by Noreen's history of violence, the evidence showed she actively participated in abusing Malachi rather than simply failing to protect him. Her own actions demonstrated independent culpability for the child's death. One of Noreen's attorneys asked the jury to consider that Noreen has been a good father to his own 4 children. This defense strategy attempted to create doubt about his capacity for child abuse, while simultaneously highlighting the selective nature of the violence. The argument failed to persuade jurors, who recognized that previous good behavior could not excuse the systematic torture of Malachi. The evidence presented during trial included graphic photographs of Malachi's injuries and testimony about his final days of suffering. The jury was forced to confront the reality of what a 2-year-old child endured at the hands of adults who should have protected him. This evidence proved decisive in their recommendation for the death penalty. Belinda Magana, 29, sniffled during sentencing, but her emotional display failed to convince the court that she felt genuine remorse for her actions. The judge noted that her behavior during the trial suggested more concern for her own fate than for the child she had helped torture to death. This lack of authentic remorse reinforced the appropriateness of the death sentence. Prison officials noted that Magana continued to minimize her role in Malachi's death even after conviction, suggesting she lacked full understanding of her culpability or genuine acceptance of responsibility. Her inability to acknowledge the full scope of her actions represented a continued danger to society and reinforced correctness of the jury's verdict. Malachi's death could have been prevented at multiple points if the adults responsible for him had chosen compassion over cruelty, medical care over neglect, or protection over abuse. Instead, they chose to torture a defenseless child until he died from their systematic violence. Michelle Lynn Michaud. Michelle Lynn Michaud was 39 years old when her death sentence became final. James Anthony DeVeggio, 42, and his then lover, Michelle Lynn Michaud, 43, were sentenced by Alameda County Superior Court Judge Larry Goodman in Oakland for killing 22-year-old Vanessa Leigh Sampson on December 2, 1997. Living in California with her boyfriend James Anthony DeVeggio, she appeared in Neighbors as an unremarkable middle-aged woman managing the challenges of an ordinary life. The reality beneath that facade would prove far more sinister. Before December 1997, Michaud had lived quietly without attracting significant attention from law enforcement or community members. She worked sporadically, maintaining a low profile while involved in an increasingly volatile relationship with DeVeggio. Court records revealed limited criminal history prior to the crimes that would define her legacy, though investigators later uncovered evidence of escalating antisocial behavior patterns that had remained hidden from public view. Michelle Lynn Michaud and his then lover, James Anthony DeVeggio, were sentenced to death in California for abducting, sexually torturing, and killing Vanessa Leigh Sampson, 22, on December 2, 1997. One of the suspects, Michelle Lynn Michaud, 39, confessed to FBI agents that she and her lover, James Anthony DeVeggio, 37, had also kidnapped Sampson. The confession would reveal the systematic nature of their crimes and the calculated planning that preceded Vanessa's abduction and murder. The relationship between Michaud and DeVeggio had developed into a dangerous partnership that fed off shared fantasies of control and violence. Evidence presented during trial showed they had modified their vehicle specifically for the purpose of kidnapping and assaulting victims. The van contained restraints, modified tools for torture, and soundproofing designed to prevent victims from alerting passers-by during attacks. On December 2, 1997, Vanessa Leigh Sampson became their target. The 22-year-old Pleasanton woman was going about her daily routine when Michaud and DeVeggio spotted her and decided to act on their violent plans. James DeVeggio, 57, and Michelle Michaud, 59, were given the death penalties in Alameda County Superior Court in 2002 for kidnapping Vanessa Leigh Sampson on the morning of December 2nd, 1997, raping her with modified curling irons and murdering her by strangulation with a rope. James DeVeggio and Michelle Michaud sentenced to death for kidnapping Vanessa Sampson of Pleasanton into their specially rigged van, sexually torturing her and strangling her before dumping her body in Alpine County in 1997. The attack began with deception and escalated into prolonged torture. Michaud played an active role in luring Sampson into their modified van, where both defendants subjected her to sexual assault using modified instruments designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering. The level of premeditation became clear through forensic evidence, showing the defendants had prepared specific tools and restraints for the assault. This case arises from the kidnapping, rape by instrument, and murder of Vanessa Leigh Sampson. The discovery of additional victims revealed that Sampson's murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of sexual violence perpetrated by the couple across multiple jurisdictions. After torturing Sampson for an extended period, Michaud and DeVeggio strangled her with rope and disposed of her body in a remote location in Alpine County. The dumping site was chosen for its isolation, demonstrating their awareness of the severity of their crimes and their desire to avoid detection. The body's location made recovery difficult and delayed the investigation that would eventually bring them to justice. The investigation that followed involved coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies across California and Nevada. Forensic evidence recovered from a modified van provided crucial links to the crimes, while victim testimony from survivors helped establish the defendants' methods and patterns of operation. The scope of the investigation revealed additional uncharged offenses that painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior. During legal proceedings, the prosecution emphasized the premeditated nature of the crimes and the extraordinary level of cruelty inflicted on victims. The modification of their vehicle, the preparation of torture instruments, and the systematic approach to victim selection demonstrated consciousness of guilt and deliberate planning. Defense arguments focusing on Michaud's subordinate role in the relationship failed to convince jurors of reduced culpability. Michaud's active participation in planning, luring victims, and carrying out assaults demonstrated independent decision-making and full awareness of her actions. Her confession to FBI agents included detailed descriptions of her own conduct that contradicted defense arguments about passive involvement. A jury that convicted the pair recommended the death penalty in June. The unanimous recommendation reflected the jury's conclusion that aggravating circumstances far outweighed any potential mitigation. The torture, sexual violence, and callous disposal of victims represented the kind of crimes that demanded society's ultimate punishment. Victim impact statements during the penalty phase described the devastating loss experienced by Sampson's family and the lasting trauma inflicted on surviving victims. Sampson had been a young woman with her entire life ahead of her, and her brutal murder had shattered the lives of those who loved her. The nature of the crimes meant that multiple families had been affected by Michaud and DeVeggio's violence. The modified van used in the crimes became a central piece of evidence demonstrating the thought-out nature of the attacks. Investigators found restraints, soundproofing materials, and modified tools that had been specifically prepared for sexual assault and torture. This evidence contradicted any suggestion that the crimes had been a spur-of-the-moment act of violence rather than deliberately premeditated predatory behavior. The appellate court's decision affirmed both the convictions and the death sentences, rejecting defense arguments about procedural errors and excessive punishment. The court found that the evidence supported the jury's verdicts and that the death sentences were appropriate given the extraordinary cruelty and premeditation involved in the crimes. Tanya Jamie Nelson. Tanya Jamie Nelson was 45 years old when she received California's death sentence. Tanya Nelson is an American woman sentenced to death in California on April 23, 2010 for murdering a Westminster fortune teller and her daughter on April 21, 2005. Seven-woman, five-man jury deliberated for about a day before finding Tanya Jamie Nelson, 45, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the stabbing deaths of Ha-Jade Smith, 52, and Anita Vo, 23, a Vietnamese immigrant who had built a successful boutique business in North Carolina. She appeared to those who knew her as an accomplished entrepreneur managing the complexities of American business life. The brutal reality of her actions would prove far different from her carefully constructed public image. Before the murders, Nelson had established herself as a successful business owner operating boutique shops in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. Nelson, a 46-year-old Vietnamese immigrant, North Carolina boutique shop entrepreneur, and secret escort service owner, savagely murdered two people: Ha Jade Smith, a popular Little Saigon fortune teller, and her daughter, Anita Vo. Her public success masked a more complicated private life that included operating an escort service alongside her legitimate business operations. The relationship with Ha Jade Smith began as a typical client arrangement, with Nelson seeking spiritual guidance and fortune-telling services from the popular Little Saigon practitioner. Smith had built a reputation in the Vietnamese American community as a skilled fortune teller whose advice was sought by clients facing difficult personal decisions. The consultation relationship would eventually turn deadly when Nelson became dissatisfied with the guidance she received. A California Superior Court jury Thursday convicted Nelson, 45, of masterminding the murders of mind reader Ha Jade Smith, 52, and her daughter, Anita Vo. Prosecutors argued Nelson plotted to kill Smith because a fortune teller would not give her a reading that included. The motive revealed during trial centered on Nelson's frustration with Smith's refusal to provide the specific predictions and advice she demanded, particularly regarding personal relationships and business decisions. The planning phase of the murders demonstrated calculated premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. Nelson traveled from North Carolina to California specifically to confront Smith, bringing with her the weapons and planning necessary to carry out the attacks. She denied committing the murders during a March 11th interview with a probation officer, according to a March 26th Orange County probation report. She said she came to Orange County that April to follow her estranged husband because he would not provide her with his address. Her explanations to authorities contradicted the available evidence. On April 21st, 2005, Nelson arrived at Smith's Westminster office for what appeared to be a routine consultation. The setting provided privacy for the attack, with Smith's daughter Anita present during the consultation. The isolated location of the fortune-telling business meant that help would not arrive in time to save either victim once the violence began. The attack itself was swift but brutal, with both victims suffering multiple stab wounds that indicated prolonged assault rather than quick dispatch. In February, a jury concluded that Nelson had masterminded it all. The prosecution's case emphasized Nelson's role as the primary planner and executor of the murders, rejecting defense arguments that she had acted with accomplices who bore greater responsibility. Evidence showed she had researched Smith's business, planned the timing of the attack, and brought weapons specifically chosen for the assault. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence about Nelson's business operations and personal life that provided context for her motives. Her frustration with Smith's fortune-telling advice appeared to stem from unrealistic expectations about what spiritual guidance could provide, particularly regarding her troubled marriage and business concerns. When Smith refused to tell her what she wanted to hear, Nelson's response escalated from dissatisfaction to homicidal rage. Tanya Jamie Nelson faces a death penalty hearing next week because her jury convicted her of the special circumstances of committing multiple murders during the commission of robbery, and murder by lying in wait. The special circumstances findings reflected the jury's conclusion that the murders involved aggravating factors that elevated them beyond typical homicides to crimes deserving capital punishment. Victim impact statements during the penalty phase described the devastating loss experienced by the victim's family members and the Vietnamese American community that had relied on Smith's services. In a press conference, Lo No, Ha sister, said, "I prayed every night for this." The community's reaction reflected not only grief for the victims, but recognition that Nelson had destroyed a valued cultural resource in eliminating Smith's fortune-telling practice. The lying in wait specification demonstrated that Nelson had carefully planned the timing and location of the attacks to maximize her chances of success, while minimizing the risk of interruption or escape by the victims. This level of premeditation contradicted defense arguments about temporary mental impairment or emotional disturbance driving her actions. Expert testimony during the trial explored Nelson's background and psychological state, though no evidence emerged suggesting serious mental illness that would have impaired her understanding of right and wrong. Her successful business operations and careful planning of the murders demonstrated cognitive capacity and awareness of consequences. The court rejected defense arguments, seeking to mitigate her culpability based on cultural factors or business stress. Retiring Frank F. Fassel is a type of no-nonsense Orange County judge who appreciates people who make their points quickly. But Fassel wasn't impressed by Tanya Jamie Nelson's pithy pre-sentencing message designed to keep herself off California's notorious death row. The judge's response to Nelson's final plea for mercy reflected his assessment that her crimes demanded the ultimate punishment despite her attempts to minimize her culpability. The death sentence imposed on Nelson reflected the court's conclusion that the systematic planning, multiple victims, and additional criminal conduct involved in the case warranted capital punishment. Her transformation from successful businesswoman to double murderer demonstrated that economic success and social integration could not excuse the deliberate taking of innocent lives for personal grievances. Prison officials noted that Nelson continued to deny responsibility for the murders even after conviction, suggesting a lack of genuine remorse or acceptance of accountability for her actions. Her inability to acknowledge the full scope of her crimes raised questions about her potential for rehabilitation and reinforced the appropriateness of the death sentence. On February 15, 2010, Tanya was found guilty and she was sentenced to death. She is awaiting execution at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Her incarceration on death row represents the final chapter in a case that demonstrated how personal disappointment and unrealistic expectations can escalate into deadly violence when combined with antisocial tendencies and careful planning. Kathy Lynn Sariñana. Kathy Lynn Sariñana was 36 years old when she participated in one of California's most disturbing child abuse cases. Living in Corona with her husband Raul Ricardo Sariñana, she had taken custody of her two young nephews after their parents died. Conrad Morales, 13 years old. Ricky Morales, 11. What should have been an act of family compassion became a nightmare of systematic torture that would shock investigators and lead both Sariñanas directly to death row. The boys came to live with their aunt and uncle in 2005, following the tragic deaths of their parents. Social workers had approved the placement, believing the children would find stability and care with their extended family. Initial reports suggested the Sariñanas were providing a loving home for the orphan brothers. Neighbors saw what appeared to be a normal household, with the boys attending school and participating in everyday activities. Yet behind closed doors, a pattern of escalating abuse had already begun. Court records reveal that Kathy Sariñana had grown resentful of the responsibility thrust upon her. The addition of two grieving children to her household created stress she was unwilling to manage through conventional means. Instead, she and her husband developed a twisted system of punishment that grew increasingly violent over the months that followed. What began as harsh discipline evolved into sustained torture that would ultimately claim both children's lives. The abuse escalated dramatically as 2005 progressed. Prosecutors would later detail a horrific pattern of starvation, beatings, and psychological torment inflicted on both boys. Conrad and Ricky were denied food for days at a time, forced to stand in stress positions for hours, and subjected to beatings that left them covered in bruises. Kathy Sariñana was not merely a witness to this abuse. She was an active participant, delivering punishments with the same brutality as her husband. In August 2005, 13-year-old Conrad Morales died in Washington state, where the family had briefly relocated. His death was initially attributed to natural causes, but investigators would later determine he had been murdered by the Sariñanas through prolonged abuse and starvation. The family returned to California shortly after, bringing Ricky back to the Corona home where his suffering would continue unabated. Christmas Day 2005 marked the end of 11-year-old Ricky Morales' life. After months of systematic abuse, Raul Sariñana delivered a series of kicks so violent they proved fatal. Kathy Sariñana stood by, offering no protection for the child she had promised to care for. Emergency responders found Ricky's body bearing evidence of prolonged torture. He was severely malnourished, covered in bruises and injuries in various stages of healing, and showed signs of systematic abuse that had occurred over many months. When investigators examined the crime scene, they discovered evidence of the horrific conditions in which both boys had lived. The house contained restraints, evidence of prolonged confinement, and signs that the children had been denied basic necessities, including adequate food, water, and medical care. Neighbors later reported hearing screaming from home, but most had dismissed it as normal childhood noise. The full extent of the boys' suffering became clear only after it was too late to save them. Kathy and Raul Sariñana were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, torture, and child abuse. Prosecutors sought the death penalty for both defendants, arguing that their actions represented the most depraved form of child abuse imaginable. Two separate juries were convened to hear the evidence against each defendant, ensuring that justice would be determined individually rather than collectively. During trial, prosecutors painted Kathy Sariñana as an equal participant in the torture of her nephews. Evidence showed she had actively beaten the children, denied them food and medical care, and participated in the psychological abuse that preceded their deaths. Defense attorneys attempted to portray her as a victim of her husband's influence, arguing that she had been coerced into participating in the abuse. This narrative was systematically dismantled by testimony showing her independent actions and choices. Witnesses testified about the systematic nature of the abuse inflicted by both Sariñanas. Teachers reported that the boys had appeared increasingly thin and frightened during their time in school. Medical examiners described injuries consistent with prolonged torture, including evidence of starvation, repeated beatings, and psychological trauma. The courtroom heard detailed accounts of suffering that left even experienced prosecutors struggling to maintain composure. In June 2009, both juries recommended death sentences for Kathy Lynn Sariñana and her husband. Judge John Montarasso imposed the death penalty on June 26, 2009, noting that their crimes represented some of the most heinous child abuse he had ever encountered. The systematic torture and murder of two orphan children, he said, demanded the ultimate punishment allowed under California law. Psychological evaluations suggested that Kathy Sariñana suffered from personality disorders that made her incapable of providing appropriate care for children. However, mental health experts emphasized that her conditions did not excuse her actions or diminish her legal responsibility. She had made conscious choices to participate in the torture of two vulnerable children who had depended on her for protection and care. The case sparked outrage throughout California and beyond, with child welfare advocates calling for reforms in the placement and monitoring of children in relative care. Conrad and Ricky Morales had already suffered the trauma of losing their parents. Their deaths at the hands of family members who promised to care for them represented a profound failure of both the system and basic human decency. Kathy Lynn Sariñana now awaits execution at Central California Women's Facility, where she has spent over a decade on death row. Appeals continue, but the overwhelming evidence against her makes successful challenges unlikely. Two innocent children trusted her to provide safety and love. Instead, she delivered systematic torture and death. Her actions violated every principle of family care and human compassion, leaving behind a legacy of unspeakable cruelty that justice continues to address through the harshest penalty available under law. Angelina Rodriguez. Angelina Rodriguez was 32 years old when she committed what prosecutors called a calculated murder disguised as natural death. Living in Montebello, California, she appeared to neighbors as a devoted wife caring for her ailing husband, Jose Francisco Frank Rodriguez. At 41, Frank had been experiencing mysterious health problems that seemed to worsen over time. His symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, puzzled doctors and concerned family members. No one suspected that his loving wife was slowly poisoning him to death. Rodriguez had a history that should have raised red flags. Born in 1968, she had been married 4 times by the age of 32, a pattern that investigators would later find significant. In 1993, she had been accused of killing her infant daughter by suffocating her with a pacifier, though charges were never filed. Friends and family described her as charming but manipulative, someone who seemed to attract tragedy wherever she went. The death of her baby daughter was ruled suspicious but inconclusive, leaving questions that would haunt investigators for years. By 2000, Rodriguez was married to Frank Rodriguez, her 4th husband in less than a decade. Frank was a hard-working man who had accumulated modest savings and carried a $250,000 life insurance policy that named Angelina as the primary beneficiary. To outsiders, their marriage appeared stable and loving, Rodriguez played the role of devoted caregiver as Frank's health declined, accompanying him at doctor visits and expressing deep concern about his mysterious illness. Medical professionals were baffled by his symptoms, which seemed to indicate some form of poisoning but couldn't be conclusively diagnosed. What doctors didn't know was that Rodriguez had been systematically poisoning her husband with multiple toxic substances over an extended period. Court evidence would later reveal that she had been slipping oleander, a poisonous plant that grows wild throughout Southern California, into Frank's food and drinks. Oleander contains cardiac glycosides that can cause heart problems, nausea, and neurological symptoms, exactly the mysterious ailments that had been plaguing Frank for months. But Rodriguez wasn't satisfied with the slow-acting effects of oleander alone. On September 9, 2000, she decided to finish what she had started. While Frank lay weakened from months of systematic poisoning, Rodriguez mixed antifreeze into his Gatorade. Ethylene glycol, the active ingredient in antifreeze, is highly toxic when ingested and can cause rapid organ failure and death. Frank drank the poisoned beverage, unaware that his wife had just administered a fatal dose of toxin. Frank Rodriguez died later that day, and initially, his death appeared to be the result of his ongoing mysterious illness. Rodriguez played the grieving widow perfectly, tearfully telling investigators that her husband had finally succumbed to the health problems that had been plaguing him for months. She immediately filed claims for his life insurance money, eager to collect the $250,000 payout that had motivated her months-long campaign of murder. The investigation might have ended there if not for a crucial mistake Rodriguez made during questioning. When detectives asked about Frank's final moments, she mentioned details about his symptoms and death that she shouldn't have known, information that only someone who had witnessed or caused his poisoning would possess. This slip of the tongue aroused investigators' suspicions and led them to order additional toxicology tests that had not been performed initially. Advanced testing revealed the presence of both oleander toxins and ethylene glycol in Frank's system, proving definitively that he had been murdered. Investigators then began examining Rodriguez's background more thoroughly, discovering her history of suspicious deaths and insurance claims. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Rodriguez appeared to systematically target vulnerable men, marry them quickly, and then eliminate them when it became financially advantageous. Detectives also reopened the investigation into the death of Rodriguez's infant daughter in 1993. While that case remained officially unsolved, investigators found disturbing similarities in the methods and motivations. Rodriguez had a pattern of eliminating people who were financially or emotionally inconvenient, using methods designed to appear natural or accidental. Her baby daughter's death, originally attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, now appeared to be another calculated murder. Rodriguez was arrested and charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances, specifically murder by poison and murder for financial gain. Prosecutors argued that she had coldly planned her husband's death over many months, slowly poisoning him while maintaining the facade of a loving wife. The premeditation was evident in her choice of multiple toxins, her careful research into their effects, and her immediate attempts to collect insurance money following Frank's death. During trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Rodriguez's guilt. Toxicology reports proved Frank had been poisoned with multiple substances. Financial records showed Rodriguez's desperate need for money and her knowledge of Frank's insurance policies. Witnesses testified about her suspicious behavior before and after Frank's death, including her unusual interest in poisonous plants and cleaning supplies that contained ethylene glycol. Rodriguez's defense team attempted to argue that Frank's death was accidental, possibly the result of contaminated medication or environmental exposure. They suggested that the oleander exposure could have occurred naturally, given the plant's prevalence in Southern California. In October 2003, a jury convicted Angelina Rodriguez of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The evidence was overwhelming. Toxicology reports, financial records, witness testimony, and her own incriminating statements all pointed to a calculated, cold-blooded murder motivated by greed. The jury also found her guilty of attempting to dissuade a witness, though they deadlocked on charges related to her attempts to have other witnesses eliminated. On January 16, 2004, Rodriguez was sentenced to death by Judge William Ryan Pounders. He noted that her crime represented profound betrayal of marital trust, describing her actions as cold, calculated, and cruel. The judge emphasized that Rodriguez had shown no remorse for her actions and had demonstrated a pattern of manipulative behavior that made her a continued danger to society. Appeals have continued for over 2 decades, with Rodriguez's defense team challenging various aspects of her conviction and sentence. In 2014, the California Supreme Court upheld her death sentence, rejecting arguments about prosecutorial misconduct and evidentiary issues. The court found that the evidence against Rodriguez was overwhelming and that her sentence was appropriate given the calculated nature of her crime. Rodriguez remains on death row at Central California Women's Facility, where she has spent over 20 years awaiting execution. At 56 years old, she continues to maintain her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. Her case stands as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators often hide behind facades of love and devotion. Frank Rodriguez trusted his wife completely, never imagining that her care was actually a slow-motion murder scheme designed to enrich herself at the cost of his life.